Thank you, Lindsay, and indeed for those words from the source. I do commend Lindsay's paper to you. It has got a very well-reasoned and structured account of the main approaches that the RMA took to dealing with things like the aspirations for national direction, effects-based planning, and where we got to with them. So thank you for sharing those initial framing thoughts, Lindsay. Our next speaker, I commence by probably making one of the largest understatements of legal history, is a Dunedin barrister specialising in public and environmental law. He was appointed a QC in 1998. He's a former environmental law lecturer at Otago University. He's served on numerous national and international professional organisations. He's on the Council of Otago University as a Fellow of Knox College, Chair of the Knox College and Salmon College Councils. I just Googled this before because I thought the bio I had was woefully inadequate and needed to be Ubered up a little bit. He not only has done all of that, he has chaired the Board of Inquiry on the National Policy Statement for Renewable Energy. He has been a lead counsel in resource management cases, too many to name but too important to ignore. I ask you all to welcome Dr. Royden, Somerville QC, to ask and answer what has happened to the RMA during its 20-odd years. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. The conference program signposts challenging issues for the environment and for resource management law jurisprudence. But I think probably the greatest challenge for me is, where is David Kirkpatrick? He was meant to be speaking this afternoon, and I suspect I was asked because I'm one of the few, besides Judge Kenderdine, who does remember the National Development Act and what a nightmare it was. Perhaps the greatest criticism of the way in which the legal framework of the RMA has functioned is that it has continued to change so often. In my view, it reached a farcical level when in 2009 an amendment was passed entitled Resource Management Simplifying and Streamlining Amendment Act, with 166 added sections and schedules amending numerous sections of the Principal Act. Many of the changes or amendments to the Act have related to the goal of expediting the procedures for approvals in respect of development in order to promote economic growth and development. They have dealt with issues over transaction costs. And in the New Zealand Herald, on Thursday, September the 11th this year, prior to the general election, the headlines read, "RMA must be sorted out, Chief Executive Officers. Some business leaders see the RMA as a growth inhibitor and some want it scrapped," writes Greg Hall. And within that article was a survey of business CEOs. And the survey disclosed that 33% considered the RMA to be fundamentally broken. 35% felt it can work if councils are constrained. 30% considered it fine if planning processes are shortened, and 2% fine as it is. Now, due to the constraints of time, I want to focus on two areas where I consider changes to the RMA have thrown up limitations of current reasoning methods that we adopt in this jurisprudence. Methods such as reasoning by analogy in a way that suits the common law, or using a pragmatic reasoning process, or predictive reasoning approaches which call on methodology found in economics and in science, which includes the language of risk. All of these reasoning approaches are currently employed by decision makers when addressing resource management issues. The scope of environmental law and the RMA means the Environment Court and Superior Courts are required to develop reasoning methods which are not necessarily found in other areas of the law. The subject of 2 amendments disclose that current reasoning approaches may not be suitable for addressing complex law and policy areas of resource management. First, turning to reasoning and Maori values. The RMA contains numerous provisions incorporating Maori custom. The New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement refers to tikanga Maori in Policy 2C. The Resource Management Act was amended in 1997 to introduce into the definition sections a reference to tikanga Maori. Justice Joseph Williams, in his Harkness Henry lecture in 2013, opined that the RMA is the most sophisticated example of what he referred to as cultural interfacing where tikanga is involved. He also considered that the approach taken by the superior courts in some RMA cases has displayed that considerations of tikanga are compromised and are easily set to one side, if necessary, and pursuant of the Western and empirical view of sustainable management. As a footnote, he did comment favourably on the reasoning approach by the Environment Court, where it took a postmodern relativistic approach as a reasoning approach in a case involving a meeting house at Whakatane. Despite Justice Williams considering the case a marker of progress, he expressed disappointment that the RMA has not bridged any cultural or structural gaps in the decision-making power between iwi and other groups. He considered that although there have been positive advances under the framework, the fact that iwi have not been able to take resource management initiatives on matters of deep significance to them amounts to a significant admission of failure in the RMA itself. Deputy Chief Judge Karen Fox will speak at this conference on the failure of the legal framework within the RMA to deliver true partnership outcomes when it comes to use and protection of natural resources. The Maori customary values involving the commons need to be built into our reasoning approaches. Tikanga Maori needs to be a central part of any reasoning approach by the Environment Court. The ongoing jurisprudence or development of jurisprudence in the area of environmental law and tikanga will inevitably need to draw heavily on secondary sources of law. Discussions in academic law articles and other secondary sources, such as the New Zealand Law Commission report on Maori custom and values in New Zealand, can assist when developing reasoning processes for addressing tikanga in environmental law. The second area where there's been significant amendment to the RMA, and particularly Section 9, involves the area of climate change and renewable energy. A definition of climate change is now included in the Act. In an international context, the New Zealand Environment Court's unique appellate jurisdiction under the RMA to make decisions during the development phase of proposed local government policy and planning instruments referred to it, raises significant law and policy issues for the Court when it involves addressing the effects of climate change. Internationally, there is a good deal of movement towards seeking to establish legal frameworks which integrate human rights with environmental justice. Stephen Humphreys, writing on climate change, the claim of the past, in the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment, has written, examining human rights law, trade law, and the overarching ideal of the rule of law, shows the particular form taken by law in international and transnational affairs, having largely followed the historical progress of industrialisation. Colonialism and globalisation is particularly ill-suited to this task of addressing this vulnerability. John Knox, writing on climate ethics and human rights, said, "The host of issues raised by climate change includes questions of science, what can be done, economics, what can we afford to do, and politics, what can we agree on. The most fundamental question, however, is essentially an ethical one. What should we try to do? Science, economics and politics may help to define the possible climate policies, but they cannot determine which policies we should adopt. The difficulty with climate change effects is that it is not a straightforward process to impose regulatory responses requiring the mitigation of anthropocentric discharges of greenhouse gases by requiring them to be reduced to an arbitrary historical level. Adaptive management is a risk management approach to climate change effects being favoured in the international literature. In a recent IPCC report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, it states integration of adaptation into planning and decision making can promote synergies with development and disaster risk reduction. There is now a significant body of international literature, including journal articles, on how to develop law and policy responses to climate change effects by using adaptive governance and management approaches. But the reasoning processes need to incorporate precaution, resilience, and flexibility into risk management methods. Decision makers have traditionally preferred to bring a matter to an end by granting or declining consent, imposing conditions, making declaratory statements about the validity of rules, and then to be functus officio. Adaptive management involves a complete rethink of our reasoning processes where uncertainty is the central concern. We cannot establish the bottom lines. We are racing to the bottom. We cannot establish the bottom lines. We cannot predict outcomes. We have not got certainty, so our standard reasoning approaches are not working and cannot be expected to work. As Lindsay has said, we are also facing significant challenges when it comes to the aspiration of moving to 90% renewable electricity generation. The development of a national policy statement on renewable electricity generation is the start of an REM process for considering that goal in resource management decision making. Also, we need to consider how the efficiency of the end use of energy, including demand side management, can be addressed as a public health issue within the RMA framework. It is not unusual for several statutory codes to be involved when dealing with the management of the protection, use and development of natural and physical resources. In a High Court case, Friends of Turitea Reserve Society, His Honour Justice Barraguana stated, statutes are no longer considered in isolation, but where reasonably possible, as forming part of a wider and seamless public policy. It is important, in my view, that the Specialist Environment Court develops reasoning approaches for addressing tikanga Māori and the law and policy challenges of climate change, which can then be used by decision makers involved with other statutory regimes, such as the Marine and Coastal Area Act, which deals with tikanga Māori, and the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Act, which refers to adaptive management. So in conclusion, those of us who are lawyers need to step back at conferences such as this and look at whether or not the time has come for a complete rethink of the decision maker's reasoning approach within the law and policy framework provided by the RMA. However, it needs to be a meaningful process. It may be that the RMA is not equipped to address some of these challenging law and policy issues, and a different approach has to be developed. I'm not suggesting that it's going to be straightforward, but we shouldn't fall into the trap of leaving this matter to others and expecting the officials to resolve the issue. And I'm reminded of Sir Humphrey Appleby of Yes Minister fame, when he stated about addressing a new law and policy proposal about open government, said, I explained that we are calling the white paper open government because you always dispose of the difficult bit in the title. It does less harm than in the statute books. It is the law of inverse relevance. The less you intend to do about something, the more you have to keep talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Somerville. Look, if you've all been sitting down for a while, if anyone would like to just stand up for a moment and wiggle their toes, flap their arms or hands or something like that, or do feel free to do so, because our next speaker would like you all fresh and energised. Oh, there you go. All right, that's enough. You all better sit back down again now, I think. Might be a second. It really does give me enormous pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker. Judge Hashanah Kenderdine was a judge with both the Planning Tribunal and then Environment Court from 1996 to 2006, followed by being an alternate judge until 2011. I can recall her being a very forgiving judge in my first substantive appearance, junioring for Derek Nolan. I was the one that was responsible for getting all the case citations right. It was a case to do with reverse sensitivity in Wellington Airport, and in the middle of this great screed of cases to do with reverse sensitivity, the Arataki honey case had been mistyped by our word processor as erotic honey. And Judge Kenderdine was extremely forgiving about this gross indiscretion. Judge Kenderdine is now also an accredited with the Leader Association of Dispute Resolvers, and continues to provide specialist strategic advice and facilitation services to the industry. From 2011 to 2014, she was Chair of Heritage New Zealand, and she received for her services to both the judiciary and heritage a Queen's Service Order. I would like to ask you all to give a very big warm welcome to Judge Hashanah Kenderdine.
Thank you very much, Martin. Well, kia ora tātou, and welcome, and thank you for being here. I first of all want to pay tribute to you all, the planners, whom I think are the glue in the sandwich, actually, to the practitioners, to the scientists, to all of you who have made our being here today possible. Not an easy act. So much sweat and trouble and joy has gone into this piece of legislation that it would be a great pity to see it thrown out. But from where I stand and what I've looked at in the last few weeks, it looks like a piece of Swiss cheese, holes everywhere. And it's those I want to address. And my task is to see whether it's working or not. In 1998, I did a paper to this conference, and it was entitled, I think, by Philip Milne, RMA, the best possible option. And I plunked down for the best possible options that I saw, and they started with treaty rights and moved on to integrated management and ecological sustainability and some of those things. And I revisited them for this exercise, and it's those I wish to share with you. Now, Hugh Logan noted in his examination in 2009 of how New Zealand's environmental administration works that our approaches tend to focus on the pragmatic with a fit-it mentality, and hence to drive down the bigger drivers of those issues which present environmental problems further down the road. And that is what I think has happened. Process has overtaken substance. and it's a major issue, as a Deputy Secretary has pointed out. We're missing the big drivers. We're missing the RMA as a vehicle for weak sustainability, and I'll talk to that in a minute, versus strong sustainability. We are missing Māori treaty rights to natural and physical resources, and I'll address that briefly, mindful that the Māori Land Court judge is going to pick it up later. We need to value and put a monetary value on our ecological and biodiversity systems. They're seriously lacking. We are eroding public participation. Then there's climate change, which has already been raised, and consultation is something I would want to address briefly. Now, some of those I may not get to eroding public participation because I think that it's enough of it's in the journals. The latest Housing Act cuts right across a number of issues that will interest you, and I urge you to have a look at that, 2004. So the first issue I wish to address is a vehicle for the weak and strong sustainability. The RMA has been seen by a number of you as promoting weak sustainability, that is, based on that presumption that economic considerations are preeminent to other issues, assuming that economic well-being is the most important aspect of our management of resources. Theories of weak sustainability imply that either environmental issues should be included in decision-making processes, but are ultimately tradable against social and economic considerations, or that all three goals can be considered simultaneously. Strong sustainability can be visualized in the form of a family of nesting dolls, in which the economy sits within society, which itself is embraced by the environment. This recognizes the reality that an economy can only exist within the context of the society, and that a society will only survive within the capacity of the environment to provide it. In the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement of 2011, we addressed the issue of Indigenous biodiversity, and we set out there a whole policy 11, to protect Indigenous biodiversity. In the coastal environment, you have to avoid a list of things. Now, the Supreme Court, in its recent decision in the EDS case, says that avoid says what it means. It means that, given the juxtaposition of mitigate and remedy in Section 5.2c, the most obvious meaning is not allow or prevent the occurrence of. I want you to keep that in your minds. Despite this, the preservation of our ecosystems, a matter of national importance under Section 6, is not a central truth as we're operating at the moment. The executive at national level may, from time to time, make environmental standards. It has not made one on this particular issue, and that's in Section 43. The result that there is very few, if any, baseline explicit minimum national standards on the issue. Enabling measures are preferred over regulations. Conditions on resource consents are the finger in the dike, and they can be very flawed. And I urge you to look at the work of Dr. Marie Brown, whom I think is here today. She is now working for the EDS. She has done a magnificent thesis on conditions. I'd like to go into it more fully here, but we don't have the time. So please look at it. She went to 100 councils. She looked at all the conditions. She came up with the conclusion that we are failing because everything ends up in a condition and it's not monitored properly. Many of them are very loose. There are no proper inventories of such matters, and councils and parties are very sort of loose in the way they address them. The Right Honourable Dame Hashanah Elias said, "Writing environmental justice will enable sustainability by enabling investment in social and environmental programs otherwise neglected in times of negative growth." The Auditor General has expressed concerns at our failing biodiversity strategy. He did that in 2013. And the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment submission on the Resource Management Reform Bill 2012 noted a sense in the proposed changes that the environment is considered the enemy of economic progress. Now go back to the image of those Russian dolls and you'll see how it's not going to work if that's the way we're going to go forward. Nature and its resources are necessary for development and cannot be replaced with anything else, not even money. Therefore, any balancing between sustainability and development is logically and scientifically leading to diminishing the resources upon which the development is dependent. And I think that that is what the Deputy Secretary was driving at in some parts of his speech. This in turn must mean that sustainable development has to meet sustainability tests, otherwise the development is not sustainable. Sustainability lays down a framework, limits, inside which, but not outside, development can take place. And that is the conclusion of somebody who visited us in about 2005, Professor Inga Bergman from Kalman from Sweden. She's Professor of Environmental Science. She was so excited she came to New Zealand to see how the RMA worked. She went back to Sweden and looked very carefully at what we're doing and was very deeply worried and disappointed. Now, on to a slightly lighter topic, treaty rights to natural and physical resources. Before the RMA, only a glancing nod was given to Maori issues in resource management issues, and that was, of course, the Mining Act, the Town and Country Planning Act, and the Water and Soil Act. But the RMA, in my view, sections 5, 6, 7, and 8, was one of the most important statutes of our century to honour Maori traditions. However, there was a big catch. There were high expectations as a result of this among Māoridom, but there were no definition of treaty principles because they were seen as ongoing, which is perfectly legitimate, but no real definition from central government about what we should be looking at, with the result that practitioners and lawyers and judges even really didn't know often what we were talking about. There were endless court disputes in the case law about consultation, and then in section 36(1)A came in, and there was no duty suddenly to consult Māori. And I think in the case that I wrote, I sort of got exasperated with this approach and said, well, how on earth can you know about what Māori are discussing if you haven't found out about it from them and from the requisite representatives? Anyway, we could sidle around that because in the same section, confusingly, it said, oh, you can consult any person, you just don't have a duty to do so. And of course, person was defined as corporation or iwi or one of those. Then there were the disputes about who had the right to be heard, whether it was iwi or hapu, whose boundaries, rohe, were influenced by the development. Then there was non-notification. Do you realize that 95% of our resource consents are non-notified? That says something. It says something about the statistics of what we're doing and why people are still complaining that the Resource Management Act is no good at all if it's all only talking about another 5% of what we discuss as case law. Then there were definitions about wahitapu, taniwha, and so on and so forth. There were discussions about, well, I can't consult with you because you're not a treaty partner, you're only a local authority. There were difficulties with the implementation of the iwi management plans. When we were doing the coastal policy statement, we went round every council and said, have you got an iwi management plan? Well, Bay of Plenty had 16, and they have worked very hard to address that issue. Very impressive. One major regional council in the South Island was given the Ngaitahu, wonderful IMP, done by the Kakara iwi, and didn't even bother to look at it. I saw that document. It was extraordinary in the depth of what it covered and what it could have meant to be implemented in the rules and regulations and so on. Then there was the foreshore and seabed legislation. There was a lack of understanding of Māori values and history by decision makers at all levels. The frustration vented by Māori academics is evidenced in the work of Professor Jacinta Ruru from Otago University. She has written 2 excellent papers I suggest you might like to read: Māori Legal Rights to Water and Ownership Management or Just Consultation in respect of, that's the question mark she raises, in respect of conservation lands. However, all is not bad in this world. There are successful indications to closing the circle of Māori disadvantage. There's the progressive enhancement of water quality. And one of the most exciting things that I came across was, of course, this discharge of raw sewage to water, which so disturbed Māori when the Act first came in. Many councils have gone to endless trouble and expense to take charge that reasonable mixing takes place before that happens in discharge to water, or there is a recycling system in place. Then there was the appointment of Māori Land Court judges to the Environment Court to help us better understand what was going on in some of the more difficult cases. An excellent initiative. There were customary agriculture orders came in through the Māori Commercial Agriculture Settlement Act, but I understand very few of those actually have come up for analysis or comment to us. It seems to be a very long, drawn-out process. Then the Waitangi Tribunal reports were made available as evidence in our Act. There was a growing need by the public, by the developers, for the collaboration with all stakeholders, and I think the Land and Water Forum was a very good example of that in bringing the Māori dimension on board properly. Co-management was set up for lakes and the Waikato, for Taupo and for the Waikato River. And then, of course, ADR processes begin to be firmly in place, both the Environment Court processes and so on. And finally, we have the Treaty Settlements Act of 2014, the Treaty Settlements and Statutory Acknowledgements Act. I suggest you have a look at that. I had a look at the one produced by the Marlborough District Council, 165 pages of absolute first-class analysis. It only applies to Crown lands, and there are some very complicated process provisions in that, but for the first time it really brings iwi into the frame where they can make some decisions along with other council members on certain things that they find very valuable. Now, I go back to, that's the lead cover of Te Tauhiu Statutory Acknowledgements, that's the Marlborough District Council cover. Now, valuing ecological and biodiversity systems is something that really needs addressing, and I think came out of the Deputy Secretary's address as well. We have protected conservation lands. They make up 33.4%. New Zealand is a hotspot for diversity. It contains 0.5% of all known species. It contains 2,788 threatened species, and 78% of our vegetation, our primary vegetation, has been lost. lost in some of the soil already talked about. The Biodiversity Policy Statement, which has not yet seen the day, of 2011, provides deeply worrying statistics on New Zealand's depletion of natural capital. I urge you to look at it. It is very concerning indeed, and certainly was a wake-up call for me. Those tiny red spots, and you can't see that really very well, I'm afraid, but the very tiny red spots are the ones that there is some protected ecological systems, but they're sort of like, again, that Swiss cheese dotted through New Zealand, and very few of them are effective. They're certainly not providing the deep ecological corridors that many other nations in the world are working to achieve. The policy statement cites top 10 councils with the greatest unprotected environments, and guess what? Queenstown and Central Otago are in the top 2. Section 32 evaluation that also accompanies this statement, which is a very good document but very wordy, suggests that the New Zealand policy statement might be the preferred option over a national policy standard, and I come back to that. There is profound concern arising around such issues as the goal of no net loss of biodiversity, that it doesn't exist in our New Zealand legislation. There are no physical accounts for ecosystem stocks, degradation or services, and valuation rules. There is no objective quantification of the compensation to make up for impact losses. The minimum standard influences. That's what influences, the minimum standard influences the level of compensation. There's no explicit policy framework for ecological compensation. And Dr. Marie Brown's impact assessment on the conditions, which are sort of at the end of the chain, demonstrates that the necessary benefits from ecological compensation requirements that we put on these big developments are simply not being met. 100 cases were assessed, 245 conditions. Compliance overall was 64-odd%. That was 2/3. The remainder were non-complying to varying degrees, and she gives the figures there. Compensation paid by the applicant was more likely to be complied with administrative conditions, not used to significantly on-the-ground ecological conditions. And consents relating to the agriculture sector were the lowest, starting at 4%. So, natural capital is something we should be looking at. Ecosystems, biodiversity, and natural resources underpin our economics. They underpin our societies, and they underpin our individual well-being. Currently, under the RMA, natural capital is economically nearly invisible. It's missed in the past opportunities to invest in natural capital, contributing to the existing biodiversity crisis we have in this country. At least I think it's a crisis. Economic services, the true value we derive from nature, these are what we should be also looking at. A useful building block to make these benefits more explicit, in fact, a key building block. The significance of natural capital, the loss, means that the loss of forests, wetlands, soils, waters, fisheries, coastal systems, all of which provide inestimable value to our society, are overlooked or poorly understood in the application of RMA in economic terms. The benefits are poorly understood. Provisionary services such as forests, which we ripped down those years ago and are still ripping down as more dairying comes in, you get the big irrigators taking out all the protection belts and some of the natural fencing that has gone on in the past. They influence local rainfall, they sequester carbon, and they regulate climate change and air pollution. They provide energy. Fresh water, life-sustaining, as you know, and I won't go near what the Land and Water Forum have so successfully done, although apparently only a third of their recommendations have been implemented. The wetlands values are important. They include mitigation of extreme events, waste treatment, provision of food, climate regulation, provision of raw material, recreation, water regulation, tourism. Some councils and residents that we met on the NZCPS Board of Inquiry were concerned about the spread of mangroves. In New Zealand, however, these mangroves have value as nursery for offshore fisheries, for coastal protection, coastal storms, inundation, and climate change. One of the problems with mangroves in the Bay of Islands is that sedimentation, loss of soil, is coming in and getting caught in the mangroves, with the result that many of the water systems there are getting clogged. And so we gave limited permission in that particular region for their trimming at certain points. Then there's the loss of bees. Pollination is a very important and significant issue in our country. Overseas have lost an enormous amount of the bee population. Chopping down trees, not growing enough of the right things means that we're going to be in the situation, same here. The valuation of natural assets, therefore, under the RMA is really very weak indeed. There is a very good article, and I won't quote it here at any length, by Mark Christensen from Anderson Lloyd Lawyers, in which he looks at identifying case law about the courts, the Environment Court's reservations about the usefulness on putting a price of natural capital on ecosystems. And he goes through this, and I acknowledge to my colleagues some of the very difficult cases you've gone into since I left the court and have looked at the valuation of economic assets in a broad general sense, because that's really all the tools that you were given, and you were given some economics, but not, I suspect, quite the right thing. Christensen concludes that concluding the RMA requires a wider exercise of judgment, highlighting the work and concepts of the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity reports in TEEB. And I'm sure that's known to the economists in this room. Was conceived by the G8 nations in Potsdam. Those reports are available. I read them for the purposes of this, and I really commend you. There are some excellent directions and policy directions in them. So Christensen concludes by highlighting the absence of natural direction on such issues compared with the UK. For instance, the UK government means that we are failing in what we're doing under the RMA. So for reform, I looked very carefully at the statement, as I said, but really a national environmental standard seems to be much more effective. It will set the bottom lines that we need in this issue. It can provide technical standards, methods, requirements. They can prohibit or allow, restrict activities, describe, set limits. They can specify activity, location, scope, and timescale, and they can incorporate material by reference. There are some national initiatives. It is a great tribute to the government that the New Zealand Biological Heritage Science Challenge funding has just been set up, 25.8 million, guaranteed for the first 5 years towards reversing the decline of New Zealand's biodiversity. There's been the recent gazettal of 5 marine reserves, and there has been the decline of 2 large infrastructure projects impacting on conservation lands. So now I would like to jump about a bit because I'm running out of time badly. Climate change, I think it's been touched upon here, but you may not know that the statistics say much of New Zealand's population, 65%, and critical infrastructure is now located within 5 kilometres of the coast. There is impoverished national leadership about climate change relating to national and physical resources, with the exception of the New Zealand National Policy Statement, which has a series of policies about them. Because the issue has been devolved to regional and district councils. They don't have, they tell me, the funding to really deal with the very extreme issues that they're confronting. No extra funding has been identified, and there are weak financial incentives for them to do anything. The damaging storms and floods, far northeast coast, Tamaki, the northwestern motorway in Auckland, and the Kaikoura coastline, all of which have cost millions of dollars to address. The flood management plans in Omaha for 100-year events in Auckland was challenged by the residents, and that's still on hold. The Kapiti Coast hazard lines reports are ongoing. The threats of legal action by 1,800 concerned residents about their property values just shows that what is at issue here. Property rights are going to be first and front and foremost. The Environment Court deals with some of these issues with precautionary principle and application of risk assessments. But in the Mahinga Beach case, a blunt instrument, as one practitioner has used the phrase, Mr. Maxted's 6-year battle for consent to raise a beautiful home in the hazard zone on Māori ancestral land in the Hawke's Bay was given consent, but it has to be relocatable, $35,000 bond for relocation with the sea when the sea reaches 7 metres from the property. Standards, I agree with Royden that the standards are really a difficult issue in this area because the science is changing so quickly. In the Peka Peka motorway case in Wellington, the scientist Professor Manning and Mr. Levy for the Transit Authority, who is an engineer, I think, they both came to the conclusion that 1.5 metres was going to be a level around the lifetime of that particular motorway, when in fact the IPCC is using 0.5. And then, of course, there was an Antarctic scientist who was reported in the Dominion the other day saying, well, sorry chaps, our assessment of the Antarctic melt is it's going to be 4 metres. And you think about that, and it gets really, really tricky. I'll just quickly go through this. Global warming is now irreversible. Nothing can prevent large parts of the planet becoming too hot to live in, with others sinking underwater by 2040. Our only chance now is to start planning how to survive, acknowledge that we need more technology, not less. Those are the hotspots. This is on the climate change website put out by the Ministry for the Environment. You'll see the coastal sprawl down there. Those houses are going to be affected, although not all New Zealand is a hazard zone. This is St Clair, which is having major issues, as you know, on the esplanade. That's one of the old photographs of the coastal dunes. And that's one of the ones taken early in the century when all that sand was available. They have several issues. I urge you to go out and have a look at what's happening there. It's a real headache for the council, hideously expensive, and they think they may have to go back and open up one of those dune systems and let the water through. And you imagine what's going to happen, because that all originally was a wetland, that inner area. So that's the West Coast, hard protection structures, no protection structures. Would you put a hard protection structure there? This is Fremantle, with 1 metre rise, you can see there, and that's Fremantle with a 3 metre sea level rise. The whole of the downtown area would be wiped out. So, consultation and backloading, that's my finish for the day. If you don't get in early and consult, you're in for trouble. And I see so many companies doing this, so many developers. What you need to do is, if you backload, you've got initially Happy Face, the developer, on one side, you've got all the undecided people in the middle, and they've got the rest with little black faces. If you consult early, before you write the AEE, when you've got a schematic proposal, consult, then do your AEE, but it get peer reviewed, and then everything can flow from this. Thank you so much for your time and patience, and I'm sorry that I've kept you over time.
Look, I would like to spend a few minutes just taking some questions. I think this is a very important introductory session to the conference, and to reflect and respond to what we've just heard. I can kick off if you like, but is there someone from the floor? Klaus Bosselman, would you like to lead with a question to get us underway? Thank you. Got the question. How would you go back to those initial intentions for the Act for delivering environmental sustainability paradigm? Lindsay, you kicked it off.
Well, I've kind of already indicated that, yes, of course, I'd like to see a decent strategic, all the rest of it happen. Unfortunately, I don't believe we New Zealanders do this. We never have, and I don't think we ever will. So you have to try and chunk it into pieces that people will cope with. And sadly, environment is too difficult for a lot of people to understand what's going on. The best I can say is I hope James Palmer does his best, and I'm sure he will. That's all you can do, is try and widen the horizon as best as you can. I'd love to see a Sustainability Council, a Planning Council, a National Development, all again. But there's not much sign of it. Sorry to be a bit pessimistic there, but whatever anyone can do who's got an ability to advise go for it.
Does anyone else on the panel want to reflect on that question that's been asked? It's quite a demanding one.
So I shouldn't try, should I?
No, I rise to the challenge.
This conference has got so many sessions on that very issue. Professor Fisher tomorrow is talking about constitutionalism, administrative law and the environment. Professor Roll was talking about the ability of aligning adaptive approaches through all levels of government. I believe, though, that we actually have to lift our sights from within our own jurisprudence, within our approach to the RMA, which to a large extent is just grafting things onto old town and country planning approaches when it comes to land use and when it comes to water and air and so forth. At the policy, law and policy level, that's where the thrust has to come from, I believe. And the international narrative at the moment is looking at different forms of governance and different methods of dealing with these global issues. So I think it's time to, and this conference is a good opportunity to actually stand back and rethink the model.
I'm not quite so pessimistic about the New Zealand public. I think, well, maybe I'm just an optimist at one level, but I really think there is a change abroad. There are so many little groups which are interested in wetlands and so on. There's the freshwater accord with the dairy companies where we've brought in protection of wetlands and ephemeral streams and rivers. Some of that has got to kick in. I do think that at the national level, things have to be stepped up. And I think that if we start setting standards and we start funding from the national level, regional councils to be able to deal with this properly, they're given the power under section, I think it's 43, but they may, no, that's the national government, national standard, but they are instructed in one of the amendments to deal with biodiversity, but I don't think that they have adequate funding to stop and actually go around and identify all those little dots you saw, how they might be increased, how they might be protected, and so on. So I think that there's a lot of work to do at all levels on this. And the community at the end of the day, as it will be on climate change, is probably one of the most important resources we have, which means education on these issues and how you go about protecting them. There's hardly any coastal vegetation left, natural coastal vegetation left. Think about it, and think about Arigato for those who know that case.
Dr. Somerville, submissions and reply.
The Mary Robinson is part of a group that Council know about that's come out with the Declaration on Climate Change, and she says that the rule of law is extremely important in dealing with these issues. And I believe there's a great resource in the work that groups like the International Bar Association and so forth are doing at the moment in this area, and that's when I say we should stand back a wee bit and look at it, because there's climate change I'm talking about. I think it's too much to expect local authorities to deal with climate change effects. We need to work out another way of dealing with it.
Look, I'm sure there will be no violent objection to spending 5 more minutes before we rush out to drinks in the welcome function. I'd like to just pick up on that last question and ask this also. Given this is a retrospective, could I just ask our panel, we don't have a control New Zealand. We don't know what New Zealand would have been under the Town and Country Planning Act and the Water and Soil Conservation Act and all those other acts and the National Development Act, etc., had they endured for all of this time. So, you know, I guess any pessimism or despondency needs to be somewhat tempered. But looking back over the last 23 years since the RMA has been passed, could I ask each of the panellists in just really bullet point form, if you like, to respond with what you think the biggest achievements under the RMA have been, the biggest singular achievement and the biggest single failure.
Well, I think we have integrated environmental issues together, and I would say in the world of water allocation, of water quality, with the exception of nutrients at the moment, sadly, and in pollution management, particularly in air quality, we've come a long way of achieving things. I mean, we don't have raw sewage being thrown into our harbours and coasts anymore. We did in the 1980s. So when you think back, there's been a lot of actual incremental but progressive change. The unfortunate thing is that we've still got a much bigger picture to look at, and as this session has shown, it's very difficult to grasp all of it. And yet the issues we have to grasp are huge. They're not just little tiny things, they're not just day-to-day things or neighbourhood things, they're global things actually. And to me, dealing with things like energy, which is the biggest single most significant issue we humans face, our profligate use of that and the forms we use it in, and the way that translates into other issues is one of the monstrous issues that we haven't yet dealt enough. And what Royden says about the legislative framework being pretty damn clear about that, I think is one of the failures we need to correct.
I think on reflection that the New Zealand's role in engaging in sustainability has been significant. I think the Resource Management Act, which is its purpose is informed by excellent principles in section 6 and 7. I believe the integrated model is a good model, and above all, I think we should applaud our Specialist Environment Court for addressing or for building up a jurisprudence that is not available in general courts, and I think we can be proud of that. But I do think we have got to the stage now where the framework that we use for these major issues is not adequate.
I would echo Royden's comments. It is, as I said, like a piece of Swiss cheese. And the process has overtaken the substance. I think if we separated out those two things, we'd have a much clearer vision of where we're going. And if you go back to the fact that we have 95% of all resource consents non-notified, what on earth are we talking about here? I mean, it's shameful that some of the most important issues have slipped under the radar because, what, people are ill-informed, they're not out in the country, they're not being able to swim in the rivers. Something needs to happen, and it's that the community needs to really grasp hold of this and demand better of us, right across the board. So having said that, as I started out to do, congratulate all of you here who have tried to make the RMA work and work successfully. We've had many, many experts before us, all of whom sincere, all of whom work hideously long hours, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. Look, I actually think that's a pretty good full stop to a 2-hour session.